Well, kia ora, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Passing the Torch. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by Steve Abel. So, thanks so much, Steve, for taking the time out to do this today.
Oh, good.
So, I'm just going to start off with the same question I ask all of my interviewees, which is could you just give a brief introduction in your own words of sort of who you are?
Okay. I guess I am a New Zealander raised in Tamaki Makaurau, and I got sort of introduced to activism from a relatively young age because it was the height of a lot of movements were happening through the late 70s and the early 80s when I was a kid and a teenager. The anti-Springbok movement or the anti-apartheid movement, the nuclear-free movement, and so forth. And those kind of influenced my view of society and societal function and how change was possible. And then I got involved in activism myself in my significantly later, really in my later 20s, when I was 26, 27 years old. And really that set me on a course of being an activist for most of my adult life. And
Mm.
I'm also a musician. That's my other sort of passion and love, and I did that from when I was a teenager. My life has been somewhat characterized by the tension between wanting to do music and wanting to do activism.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, could you tell me about like your childhood and adolescence, like what life was like for you growing up?
I mean, it's pretty good. I was brought up in a middle class family, so um, I had the sort of privilege of not having sort of fundamental wants, um, and I went to school in Mongafo and Mount Eden and Mana School Grammar, and my parents were of a sort of progressive bent. They were they were not particularly kind of radical people, but they believed in sort of core values around social justice and an inclusive society. And so they took me on the march against the Springbok tour when I was 11 years old, um, and so I was raised in a household that was socially conscious and thought about issues of the world. Um, I had an interesting experience educationally because I couldn't read when I was 8 years old, and at the time they said I was dyslexic, and I subsequently got sort of taught to read through phonics by someone called Margaret Hooton, and so that gave me an interesting experience of the world where I didn't seem to fit in, and I'd been sort of told from a young age that I was stupid and things like that. And one of the effects of that was to give me a sort of an inbuilt skepticism of authority, probably, and in a way that's put me in good stead because I think that that attitude that it ain't necessarily so the way that the norms of society function is quite a good attitude for having a critical approach to the state of the world and an
Mm.
ability to um, critically establish other ways the world could be and sort of unpick um,
Yeah.
the status quo effectively, which is a key element of being a change advocate and a change
Mm.
maker and an activist.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about being steeped in sort of politics and activism from a young age, obviously product of the time. But what was your first sort of step into that world?
Um, I guess it probably, as I mentioned, the Springbok tour. I very distinctly remember that. I guess I was just reaching the age, just 10, 11 years old, where I could understand those concepts or took an interest in those concepts.
Mm.
And I hadn't, yeah. And my parents, it was on the television, it was wall to wall. We were in Mount Eden. And so the third test was played at Eden Park, and I remember my parents driving us down, and there was all these um, containers around the rugby ground to stop people from getting in barbed wire. It was like a military zone, and something that we'd never seen before was kind of felt like, what is going on here? And so I remember that. I remember the energy of that time. My parents took me down to Felds Park where protesters were assembling before they marched in Eden Park, and the organisers said, he's too young to be here. So I had to go home, and I remember feeling really disappointed that I couldn't be part of this march against apartheid. And I guess that gave me a sense of the energy and the sort of nature of organising around it. And then the other thing that was happening contemporaneously was the anti-nuclear movement, which was all pervasive as well. And I went on marches up Queen Street. A friend of the family took us on the marches up Queen Street against nuclear. I think it was the one in '83 when the USS Texas visited Auckland. There's about 20,000 people marched up Queen Street, and that was it. The energy in that experience and the feeling of being part of a movement like that is very intense, and it was very high in the subject matter and discussions and political discourse on television all around us. There were posters in the street. Boroughs were being declared nuclear-free zones. There were songs on the radio. It was like nuclear-free was everywhere, and so it was a very powerful, visceral experience and movement in society, and it succeeded. Like it was a hot topic in the '84 election, and the Malden government was effectively brought down over the issue because of Marilyn Waring crossing the floor. And then we got this change of government, and we got this leader who was prepared to take a stand on us being nuclear free, and we refused the USS Buchanan, or Longy refused the USS Buchanan from visiting in February '85, and then that began this process of us being vilified for the stand we'd taken, and those were my teenage years. I was 10 in 1980, and I was 15 in '85. And that same year, of course, the Rainbow Warrior got bombed in Auckland Harbour, the Greenpeace flagship, and on the 10th of July 1985, and that was also just like, what? Like, it was front page news for weeks, and all of those things gave me this strong experience of what society was like. It just happened to be the time I was raised in the country I was raised in a sense, that gave me that feeling of it. And so I had this expectation that's the way the world is, and the way the world should be. The people and people's movements demand principles, and politicians respond to those,
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, 100%. One of your first big environmental protests, I guess, was the logging of against the logging of native trees down on the West Coast. Could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up down there?
Yeah, because I've been traveling. I sort of did my OE. I went to the UK, and I sort of backpacked around the world and stuff, and did South Asia predominantly, and in Malaysia I'd seen large scale rainforest destruction for palm plantations, and I transferred the Taman Negara National Park, and had this really powerful experience of seeing what was happening to forests, and how bad it was, And I came back to New Zealand. I thought, well, at least in New Zealand we don't have rainforest logging anymore. And then I saw this poster on the wall of my flatmate, which was Haere Mai, Native Forest Action welcomes all those who respect the forest. And there's this big banner hung out of a giant rimu tree alongside a river, with a guy standing right on the top of the tree. And I was like, what is this? So there's logging of ancient native forest in New Zealand happening right now. And I just immediately knew I wanted to be part of that campaign to stop that logging. So that was the first activism that I was directly involved in as an organizer, as an activist, as a participant, as a campaigner. And I was 27 years old. So I for many people, it's kind of late in life to begin activism. A lot of people start in their teens or their early 20s, And so, and that was the education, I guess, into how effective organising worked. We were under the tutelage of Nikki Hager, who had been part of Native Forest Action Council, 10 years or 15 years earlier, that had really important success in saving native forest. But there'd been this thing called the West Coast Accord in 1986, which had made a compromise and allowed some forests to be sacrificed so that some forests could be saved. And the conservation movement had, for many people, felt that was a bad compromise, that we shouldn't have accepted any native forests being destroyed. And so this new young movement came along a decade later, in the mid-90s, and said, hang on a minute, we don't accept this West Coast Accord. All these forests should be protected. And that was my introduction to how to do political organising, how to do effective campaigning, how to do repeated tactics, how to stick to your message, how to build movement, and just be unrelenting in the campaign demands. And lots of details we learned from Nikki Hager as our kind of mentor, effectively, on what makes for effective campaigns. And then, of course, even in the midst of us feeling it was such a difficult fight, we felt very small in those vast forests where these beautiful trees have been cut down. We were sort of kept on track, and we managed to eventually succeed in 1999 when there was a change of government, and we'd already convinced Helen Clark in opposition to commit to stopping native logging if she became Prime Minister. And so when she did, that was one of the first things that happened, with the pressure of the Green Party, I might add, because that was the year the Green Party came into Parliament.
Yeah.
In 1999. So, and so I had this incredible experience, and we all had this incredible experience, this campaign that we were part of, and we put our hearts and souls into it, succeeding. We managed to stop the logging, and 137,000 hectares of forest was gazetted as conservation estate and protected in perpetuity. So that was an incredible first first experience of activism. And once you've had that experience, it's kind of hard to do anything else. I think
Yeah.
it kind of drew me into this world of affecting change.
Yeah. You mentioned Nicky Hager a few times there, and of course he wrote a book about the Timberlands scandal, I guess. Did that
Yes.
change the way the Native Forest Action and what you guys did was perceived around the country? Did you get more attention for it, maybe?
Yeah, it's really hard in retrospect to remember how much what impact it had. And so, yes, certainly it did have an effect. But I think the way I think of it in terms of a campaign is that you sort of need multiple things happening in the campaign to keep the focus on the campaign. So, and you could describe those as tactics, and a given protest is a tactic, or a given action, or a given strategy around letter writing. And the release of the book effectively acted as like a tactic in the campaign and the ongoing story and narrative of this struggle for protecting native forest. And that's where it sits in my mind, but it would be useful probably for somebody to go back and look at what impact it had in terms of media coverage, what impact it had in terms of how high the issue was on people's radar. But my memory of it was one among many things that were keeping the issue on the agenda and putting pressure on politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Another big endeavor of yours with Greenpeace in the mid-2000s was the nationwide campaign to stop genetic engineering. I understand you were sort of fairly prominent in the organizing of that at the time. Could you talk to us about what your role was?
Yeah, so the G-Free campaign really began in the late 90s, actually. So all these things sort of crossed over and rolled into each other. So I actually remember coming up from the West Coast one time with Bridget Gibb and another couple of people, and there was a protest outside King Salmon in the top of the South Island because they'd had this report released showing that there was malignant, or not malignant, but tumours forming on the heads of the fish that were genetically engineered. And so we went and did a protest against these genetically engineered fish. And And that was happening at the same time as we were still doing the no deforestation campaign. So these things kind of rolled into each other a bit. And the height of that GE-free movement was really the late 90s and the very early 2000s. And it went through into the mid-2000s, I suppose. But I got involved and did most of the work on it that I did through Greenpeace. So after we'd won the no deforestation campaign in 99, 2000, I began volunteering at Greenpeace in 97, but had mainly focused on no deforestation. I hadn't done much Greenpeace, or some Greenpeace stuff, but I then became the campaigner on GE at Greenpeace. And our main focus was around getting the supermarkets and the food companies to commit to not using engineered ingredients for reasons of the production of the GE crops being a threat to the environment, essentially. And all of that was happening offshore. So the Roundup Ready crops produced by Monsanto and so forth were being grown in the United States and so forth. So we were convincing the companies to not import soy or use ingredients from canola and soy that were genetically engineered. And at the same time, there's this big push for us to remain a GE-free agricultural producer, to not have genetically engineered crops growing in New Zealand. There were other things going on. There were experiments with the genetic engineering of sheep in New Zealand for L-tryptophan, like for medical use, which ended up failing. That fell over, and there was all sorts of issues they had with it. And probably the most grisly thing that went on at that time was genetic engineering of cows at Rokumura, not Rokumura, Ruakaka in the South Island. No, not Ruakaka, that's up north. I'm mixing up my Rua names. What's the name of the place? It's the Agricultural Research Facility at Lincoln. But anyway, they genetically engineered cows there, and if you read the report, the official report on what happened, it's absolutely grisly, the impact of the genetic engineering on the animals. They had these terrible kind of birth impacts and multiple sort of premature births from the cows. And so, like, it didn't help the idea that genetic engineering was this kind of precision technology that we could very easily apply, and that our comprehension of the way the genome functions and the relationship between RNA and DNA was fully understood, and we could just clip out this and clip in that and change the way a whole system of genetics functioned, because these animals were very had very terrible impacts from having been genetically engineered. And so it was an extremely intense campaign. It had very high profile. I remember getting funding, getting organic shops to fund the production of stickers, GE-free NZ stickers, these sort of brightly coloured orange stickers that just appeared everywhere. We saw them on the back of everyone put them on their cars, and it was a very high profile campaign and a very hot button issue at the time. And then they had this Royal Commission of Inquiry, which ran in the early 2000s as well, and the call was that we'd become a GE-free nation. They came out with a result that said proceed with caution, was their recommendation, and we felt sort of devastated, like we've sort of been let down, that the vision of an organic GE-free nation hadn't been achieved. And yet in practice what happened was the regulatory framework that was put in place was sufficiently rigorous that it was sort of a dissuaded investment in GE, and that holds to this day. But of course there's this push for a relaxation of those rules, and of course right now it's a topic that the National Party's raised again and saying that they're going to relax the GE rules. One thing that I think is most sinister about what they're proposing is that if something's approved overseas, it should automatically be approved here. And the most destructive GE crops are the Monsanto Roundup Ready crops, the ones that are designed to have herbicide used on them, excess herbicide. And as the result of that, because Monsanto created this crop so they could sell more glyphosate, the result of that is that you get a much bigger increase in pesticide use on the crops. They're not like the other crops that are designed to have less pesticide use. They're the ones that require more Roundup because you can spray across the whole crop and it won't kill it. That creates super weeds and all sorts of problems. But that is definitely something we don't want in this country. It's like it's the worst form of genetically engineered crops. Yeah, it's a massive conversation, the GE issue.
Yeah.
And I've just been involved in the Green Party's development of the biotech policy. And one thing that we've made clear in our policy is that we support medical use of genetic engineering, and we support exploration of things like precision fermentation as an opportunity for producing vat-produced foods. Though there's some real challenges with that as well in terms of the technical possibilities, and there's a real risk of creating novel toxins and novel things in the food you produce, because much as we would like it to be a simple process, messing with things at that genetic level can create unintended consequences. And that was always the concern, that if we created a problematic species through genetic engineering and it was a self-replicating organism in the environment, that could be a real problem. And I would say that probably the extent of the risk, the cataclysmic risk that GE is purported to bring, is overstated. And the extent of the benefits that GE can bring is overstated. So like the pro-GE industry completely overstate what genetic engineering is capable of doing, at the same time as I think some of the risks that it brings are overstated as well.
Right.
So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. That's my
Yeah.
view now. But I still think we very much need to do a proceed with caution approach, and I don't support us, having. I personally don't support us having live self-replicating genetically engineered organisms in our agricultural system. It's not the way forward, in my view. Regenerative, organic, nature-based approaches to production are far more where we need to be heading.
Yeah, absolutely. You also had some protests up at the Marsdenby power station 2006. You and Martin Bradbury, I believe, broadcast a radio station while some protesters occupied on the roof. Can you explain to the listeners what led to that protest?
Yeah, so the day the Kyoto Protocol came into force, I should remember the date, but I can't. It's sometime when we began that protest. There was a proposal on the table that they refurbish the Marsdenby oil-fired power station, which was currently mothballed, and turn it into a coal-fired power station. It was under the ownership of Mana Rākau, who predominantly had hydro assets in their energy portfolio, but they wanted to basically, through this project, create the first new coal-fired power station that we'd had in New Zealand since Huntley was built, which is still the only coal-fired power station we have in New Zealand for electricity generation. And it was just a glaring example of how, as this agreement, this global agreement to take action on climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, comes into force, right now you're planning on building a coal-fired power station. Like, that is the opposite of what we need to be doing. So we occupied the roof of Marsdenby. We didn't know how long we'd lasted, but we managed to last 9 days, which was incredible. I wasn't on the roof. I was on the ground, as you say. I was acting as the campaigner on the ground, doing comms and working with the community at Ruakaka. That's the name I was thinking of before. I was mistakenly using before. And it was an incredible success, really. Like, the impact we had from doing that occupation was much greater than we kind of had hoped, I suppose. And eventually we, through the pressure we brought to bear, Mighty River Power abandoned their plans to do that coal-fired power station. And eventually it was completely dismantled and removed from the site. So now if you go to Ruakaka Beach, where previously there was this monstrous big bright green power station sitting on near the beach, it's completely gone. And some years later, actually, the guy who was head of Mighty River Power at the time, a guy called Doug Heffernan, came up to me at a cinema and said, that whole struggle over the Marsdenby power station changed the course of Mighty River Power's investment somewhat. They focused much more heavily on geothermal. And so that was really amazing to hear, because you sort of you sometimes wonder in the thick of campaigning, even when you're succeeding, whether how much of an impact you're having. But to hear that really the direction of the company was affected by that was really great. So we effectively stopped new thermal being built, and at the time, the then Helen Clark government actually put in place a thermal moratorium to say there'd be no new thermal generation, so no new gas or coal built, which is
Yeah.
as it should be. We should not be
Yeah.
building new gas or coal-fired power stations, for God's sake. It's wild that we still have to debate that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I just want to talk a little bit more about the radio. I think it was Heatwave FM that you
Yeah,
were broadcasting out. What was the idea behind that as a tool in that protest?
yeah, good question. So I mean, like, the concept was that we wanted to communicate with the local community what was going on, and as part of the complement to supporting these activists up on the roof, we thought, let's run a sort of a little temporary radio station, and that was the concept behind it. And it was just part of the action to do that. We did multiple on the ground actions. We went and highlighted where the toxic waste dump would be. Each day we had a different supporting component on the ground, the activists being on the roof. So we put up signs by the proposed dump sites for the waste ash from the coal-fired power station. We worked with the Surfers Against Sulphur, who were this local group of surfers who were concerned about the outflow into the ocean from the coal-fired power station. And we worked with the local community to have a march, actually, that came up from the beach and went to the power station. And so there was all these efforts to rally and, generate energy each day and keep the story alive. We also put a diver underwater to show, what the ecology was that would be impacted by the discharges from the power station.
Yeah.
And all these ways of highlighting that not just is it bad for the climate, but there were this massive toxic ash dump site, and there'll be impacts on the ocean, and there'll be impacts on air quality and all those things. And part of that was the radio station, because it was a platform for us to communicate more in-depth messages to the community who wanted to listen in. But it was very localized, and well, mind you, it went out on the internet as well, so there's a way for people to anywhere around the country to listen in. And we worked with Martin Bradbury on it because he'd worked in broadcasting, obviously, so he knew about all that stuff. He was aligned with the kaupapa. It'd be really interesting to hear back any of the recordings of it, if they exist even, and see what it was actually like. But it was a lot of fun as well to do that. I enjoyed doing that bit of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important when you're doing activism to also have a good time. Saul Alinsky, he was criticised on various fronts nowadays, but he wrote Rules for Radicals. One of the things he said is that in terms of doing activism, if it's a drag, it's a drag, and people won't keep showing up. Using the old term. if it's not fun, it's not fun, and you need a movement that's got things that are engaging and enjoyable, not to in any way diminish the seriousness of the issue, or to. I think that it's all about being positive. It's not always all about being positive. You have to be serious at times as well. And acknowledge the gravity of the crisis that we face ecologically, and with the climate, we have to kind of lean into that, the state of the existential threat and the scale of it, and at the same time, we need to do things that give us a sense of hope and give us a sense of agency, and so tactics and strategies that are enjoyable and meaningful is really important.
Yeah, for sure. Another big fight you had was against oil drilling in the Raukumara Basin with Te Whānui Apanui on the East Coast. And the flotilla that went out there sort of reminded me of the anti-nuclear test flotilla in French Polynesia. Was that similarity intentional?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, Te Whānau Apanui. So Greenpeace's strength is that it has this kind of boat ability. It has this association with mobilisation and boats and stuff. And Greenpeace began in 1971 with Phyllis Cormack travelling up to the Aleutian Islands, from Canada up to the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific, to protest an underground nuclear test by the US military then. And then shortly after, in 1972, we had the first sailing ship by the Vega with David McTaggart and Anna Horn sailed to French Polynesia to protest French nuclear testing in 72, and then again in 73, and with a much bigger flotilla, the Free, and then half a dozen other boats. So yes, that whole tradition of mobilising boats at sea and sailing boats, and so that the idea of a flotilla is very much in that tradition of those nuclear-free flotillas. And we were very aware of that and saying, look, part of the narrative here is that climate change is an existential threat to us on the same scale as nuclear war is. And we should think of those things in a similar category. They're threats to all of humanity. They're global threats. It doesn't matter where you are not safe from nuclear holocaust, and you're not safe from climate change. So we felt like that link to nukes was in the nuclear protest movement, and the threat of nuclear war was appropriate in the struggle against offshore oil and gas exploration.
Yeah.
Specifically, Te Whanau Apanui had said they were calling on they put a call out for support in their struggle against Petrobras and the oil drilling. So we also answered that call and wanted to tell a story of us assembling people and coming down to meet that call. And we ended up being 42 days at sea against the seismic ship, and we got this incredible welcome when we came down from Tamaki, and boats assembled down at the East Coast, and we got this incredible haka on the beach, which was just one of the most powerful experiences of my life, really, is Te Whanau Apanui welcoming us into their rohi for the struggle, which also succeeded. We also managed to get Petrobras to relinquish their permits and abandon their plans to build on the road Kumara. That was the other road that I said earlier
on. There were several additional protests against other oil drilling attempts around the country after that. And out of one of those came the Anadarko Amendment. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, basically, out of that protest came the Anadarko Amendment. That protest in the Rokumbara Basin, we were at sea for that one. They sent out the Navy against us and arrested people on boats, and arrested Elvis Teddy on the San Pietro. And then, there's a whole other story there that Elvis can tell about. Rikirangi Gage, the sort of paramount chief of Te Whanau Apanui. I don't know that he wanted to call him that, but the leader, the rangatira, he had to then drive the boat into the port and managed to avoid the Astrolabe Reef, even though he went right by it. And so there's a view that the Taniwha were guiding him in, and that's a great story that Elvis Teddy tells. But after that, we had a national government. Of course, it was the John Key government, and Simon Bridges announces on the Easter weekend that they're going to bring in place this new legislation to prohibit protest within a certain distance of oil vessels and stuff. And what was on the horizon after Petrobras had left was this Texan oil company called Anadarko, and they were due to come, and we knew they were coming, and we'd sort of committed to take protests against them. So this thing was called the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill, blah, 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 had some totally unmemorable name. So we rebranded it as the Anadarko Amendment. So that was an intentional thing. We called it the Anadarko Amendment, and that name was more memorable and it stuck. We said it's called that because it's to pay pave the way for this big Texas oil company to come here and not be hindered by the oil-free protests. And of course, we vowed to break the Anadarko Amendment, that we would, that the law was against protest, against the Bill of Rights, essentially, our right of protest. And a lot of really high-powered people came out and spoke against it, including Jeffrey Palmer, QC, former Prime Minister, and various other people. And we made a video at the time with Peter Williams, Queen's Counsel, came out against it, and I think Ted Thomas perhaps at that time as well, and my ability to recall names in quick succession. The guy who wrote Struggle Without End, what's it called? Anyway, it'll come back to me. We had a bunch of people come out and opposing that amendment, and yeah.
And then in 2018, Jacinda Ardern's government banned new oil and gas exploration permits in our EEZ, which was a big move in the right direction, I suppose. But now we have National saying they'll bring back some of those permits. How does it feel to have, after in the general public we thought it was done, how does it feel to have another setback?
Yeah, it's wild. It does my head in. We wrote this letter. Greenpeace wrote a letter. Russell Norman wrote a letter to Luxon saying, "What are you doing, dude? Like, don't bring back oil and gas exploration. Like, it's dead. It's dead." And it was not a great economic thing at the time. It was just a massive investment. New Zealand is a distant prospect, and it was hard to get offshore oil and gas happening in New Zealand, other than where it was already happening in Taranaki. We don't have infrastructure anywhere else in the country, so that's one of the reasons why we knew we could beat it, because it was a somewhat tenuous prospect, and so we could make life hard for those oil companies and for the government, and we did. We made it politically and economically unattractive to come here and do oil and gas exploration, and hence one by one the companies left. The name I was trying to remember was Ranginui Walker. He also came out at that time, the late Ranginui Walker. And so anyway, but when Luxon goes and announces that, well, actually, I mean, since we stopped it, the National Party have been saying they're going to bring it back. Simon Bridges is going to bring it back. They're all going to bring it back, and it's really interesting because it took quite a bit of work to convince Labor to ban it. They hadn't made it as an election commitment. We had to kind of get it over the line after the Ardern government came to power. And we picked up on them saying that climate change was our nuclear-free moment. We said, well, if it's your nuclear-free moment, you have to stop offshore oil and gas exploration. So there's a lot of work, sort of lobbying work, I suppose, to convince Labor to do it. And they did do it. They did the right thing. They did stop new offshore oil and gas exploration permits. They haven't stopped onshore in Taranaki. They have stopped onshore everywhere else, but not in Taranaki. And they've had these they've cooked the books a bit with allowing some things to be extended and some permits to. But in the scheme of things, the overall prospect is not great. But Luxon, man, it just does my head in. There's no version of us dealing with climate change that doesn't involve making some tough decisions to end the oil, gas, and coal industry. And we have to end it by regulation or legislation. You can't just trust the markets to do it, because markets have utterly failed to save us from climate change. In fact, they're probably one of the major causes of unsustainable economic activity that leads to climate change. So the idea that you don't regulate and legislate to phase out the extraction of fossil fuels is just it's destined to fail. We have to actually be prepared to say we're not going to extract coal from the ground anymore. We're not going to extract oil from the ground. We're going to stop those industries at the production stage. It's like the argument that you hear from the industry is, oh, you just got to stop the demand. Like, if there's no demand, then the supply will dry up. So no, you've got to shut down supply as well, because supply tightens the whole system. You have to do supply side campaigning as well as demand side campaigning.
Yeah.
And that was our strategy. And I actually would argue supply side is much more important. If you don't have oil and gas and coal that's readily available, then you have to use something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to lock fossil fuels in the ground and keep them in the Earth's crust, because we can't afford to burn all that's there if we're going to have a livable planet. So that was our strategy. We would stop this 4 million square kilometres of exclusive economic zone, which potentially has oil and gas. Will stop it from being accessible to the international oil companies, and that was who was interested. I mean, it was, Chevron and Statoil and Anadarko and Petrobras, these big international oil companies who are interested in finding this oil that we might have, or gas. And so shutting it away and saying, no, it's not accessible, is actually a really important part of it. How we win the fight against offshore oil and gas, against climate change. And same for the Arctic oil. We need to stop the Arctic from being accessed for oil, because there's potentially billions of barrels up there as well.
Yeah.
The decision by Luxon to bring it back, it really is this total cognitive dissonance. This idea that we can keep doing what we've always done, and yet at the same time address this existential crisis. It's just not true. You have to be prepared to do something very different, and that means you need to stop looking for oil and gas.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. More recently, you garnered some media attention for your protests at the against the deforestation at Canal Road in Avondale and Tamaki Makaurau.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us first of all, what made those trees so special in particular?
Yeah, so that I got involved in that during the lockdown, actually, in 2020, it must have been. And a guy called Mark Lockhart, who was part of the Tree Council, I got a couple of he made a few efforts to get hold of me, and he finally tracked me down. He said, "You've got to go and see this stand of native trees in Avondale." And I had never seen them before. And one day I was coming back from picking up my son from school, or from actually, no, it was during the lockdown, so he wasn't at school. I was picking up from his mum's place and bringing him back out west where I live. And I pulled into Canal Road in Avondale and drove along to where these trees were, just to check them out. And he and I got out of the vehicle and just saw this for the first time ever. I didn't even know it existed. Saw this beautiful stand of native trees, and it blew my mind. Actually, I was like, "Wow, this is right in the heart of the suburb, where there's these 3 adjoining properties, or 4 adjoining properties possibly, that have got this magnificent stand of trees, nearly 100 years old, all native, big puriri, these beautiful big tōtara trees, and kāwaka, and 2 black maire were there, and this massive big pūtakawa on the front edge of the property, which was the only one that was scheduled, formally protected, and another big pūtakawa at the back, and yeah, a beautiful big rewa, and beautiful big titoki, just really amazing big specimens of native trees, like all in this arboretum, effectively, like this grove of exclusively native trees that were all of this, all old, approaching 100 years old. And it was like, could it be that these are going to be cut down? I couldn't believe it. It was unimaginable. And because it was like a ready-made park, and people effectively used it as a park, because you could just run in underneath it. They're big enough that they had, it was like this beautiful grove. So a perfect complement to a neighbourhood, and particularly one that there were plans to intensify with more housing and more people living there. Then you've got this perfect location as a park. So I was immediately convinced that they had to be saved, but we didn't know when they would be cut down. We knew that it was imminent, and understanding what was happening with the sales of the property, or who owned it, or who planned to cut them down, And so it was a lot of trying to understand what the drivers were and who the people were and who we should talk to. And that's one of the struggles with these campaigns often, is understanding what's behind something happening. Anyway, we got wind that the chainsaws just showed up one day and started cutting trees down. And I only found out the night after it happened, and I was just devastated that someone hadn't called me at the time, because I would have gone to the site immediately. But it turned out that Willie Lee, who lived in the street, lived in Canal Road, had gone and stood in front of one of the machines and stopped them from cutting down more than, I think they cut down about, I don't know how many they cut down that first day, 2 or 3 or 4 trees. And I knew they'd be back the next morning. And my experience of tree protection work was that, well, if you're in the tree, they can't cut the tree down. So I got up really early the next morning and went and sat in the Puriri tree there. And someone had organised a farewell for the trees. The community was going to come down and say goodbye to the trees as if they couldn't be saved. And I was like, I came down out of the tree and I said, this is not the only option. We can potentially save these trees, but we mustn't let them be cut down now. There's an immediate need for us to stop them from being cut down. So I said, who's with me? Who wants to hear about the opportunity here to save them? And like most people are like, yeah, I'd much rather be saying we're going to fight to save these trees than do a karakia saying goodbye to the trees. I shouldn't say the word karakia, to do a prayer saying goodbye to the trees. And so so then this community who were there, many of the faces who turned up on that morning ended up being part of the Save Canal Road Trees group, and they were the local residents. They were people living in Avondale. And so I sat in the tree that day. Sure enough, the chainsaw showed up. They tried to convince me to come out of the tree. I wouldn't. They couldn't proceed, so nothing got cut down that day. And then over the course of the next 10 days, myself and Willie Lee sort of took turns at sitting in the tree. And then there was a memorial service in Wellington because Jeanette Fitzsimons had died, really unexpectedly, and I'd gone down to Wellington for this memorial service. I'd come back and sort of later on that evening, and the next morning I was late out of bed to get up and sit in the tree, and my partner was down there watching the trees, and I got this desperate phone call from her that there was all these cops there stopping them from getting onto the site, and that the chainsaws were going and the trees were being cut down. It sounded horrific. So I immediately got in my car and drove there and ran into the back of the site and jumped up into the same tree I'd been in. And this whatever tree was cut down and fell down into the canopy of the tree that I was sitting in. And then a whole lot of people rallied round, even more people rallied round to come, and arborists showed up, and Zane Wedding turned up after that, and then he built a platform, and Hannah Lipers, and a bunch of people came and built platforms, and this proper sort of occupation began. And so we'd had these 2 attacks and lost some of the trees, but most of the trees were still there. So it ended up being a 245-day occupation at Canal Road, the longest ever urban tree occupation in New Zealand. And the fact that eventually they showed up with like at least 80 cops on the final day. They made a couple of efforts to get us out of there, and that failed, where they had police mobilisations, and finally on this final day they did bring all these cops, and we couldn't stop them getting on there and doing it. It was just the most horrific experience, to be honest, and awful for everybody involved, and completely unnecessary. And this day, that site is a really very sad place. It needs some sort of cleansing. It's just such a devastating example of a failure of government and local government to recognise here as a community saying they really want to keep this element of their community, and the Auckland Council were absolutely useless and impotent in actually intervening. Mayor Phil Goff just sort of washed his hands of it. They didn't manage to do anything to actually save these trees. And no one really wins from that. Not even the landowners, the Raymonds, I don't think are that happy about what happened. I mean, they're not. It's just a shit of an experience for them. The developer, Paul Macy, said to me that he regretted not talking to us sooner, because we'd tried every way of finding a resolution. So he would get his money, they would get their money, some new developer could take it, or some, it would be bought by the council, or there'd be some sort of land swap, all these different things that could be done to save Canal Road. And it was just a lack of political will and a lack of the will on the part of the landowners and on the developer to actually resolve it, in my view. And it's heartbreaking for the community. For me, it was one of the first, this might seem weird to say this, but it was one of the first experiences of losing a campaign. Because I've been really blessed to have been part of many effective campaigns over many years that have mostly succeeded in their objectives. And for me, that was one of my first real experiences of loss of a campaign that we put everything into and yet didn't succeed. And it's, it's kind of late in my campaign career to have that experience. And it was kind of a really, it was devastating. And of course, there's a lot of self-blame that goes on in those situations. There's a lot of like, God, what could we have done differently? What could I have done differently? And I suppose it's good to have had that experience, but it's just so sad to think that those trees are gone, because honestly, they're a wonderful asset for the city, and it should be that way. Good news, though, is that we have managed to get general tree protection put back in the legislation, the Natural and Built Environments Act, because it had been taken out by John Key. There was no right of councils to do general tree protection, because had we had that still, those trees would have been protected. That's never would have been able to be cut down without a consent. And I just really call on this Luxon National Party that if they do get into government, they must not get rid of, they must follow through and keep general tree protection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and
speaking of sort of elections and politics, you've thrown your hat into the political arena a few times before, and you're doing it again this year in New Lynn with the Greens. I know some activists don't like politics or refuse to entertain it because they feel like it's selling out or various things like that, whereas others contend that you can do more inside than you can outside. What's your sort of stance on that debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big misnomer is that activists belong outside of Parliament, and if you're in Parliament, you should be a moderate. And I think the exact opposite. I think if we look at the reform governments of our own history, you think of the Savage government of the 1930s that brought in, essentially created the welfare state. The radicals were in the cabinet. I mean, we need radical transformational change makers in the Parliament. That's exactly our problem, is we don't have politicians who are willing to do what is necessary. And particularly at this time of the climate crisis, we need transformational change advocates in the Parliament. That's my view of it. And I put my hand up to say, I mean, and the other thing is that activism is politics. Everything you do in activism is basically affecting the political landscape with an end ultimately to having climate change. You don't just want legislative change, climate change. I say culture change, I should have said. You don't just want to have legislative change, you want to affect culture change. So you lock in place principles of plurality, principles of a tolerant society and an inclusive society, and principles of upholding te tiriti o waitangi and looking after the environment. All these things become cultural forms that we just can't imagine a world where women don't have the vote, or where we can't imagine a world where you would cut down an old tree, because we care for trees. And so ultimately that's like the deep change we want is at the cultural level. But law is a pathway to getting that, and a pathway to holding it in place and maintaining it. So in your activist work, you're always trying to get politicians to do the right thing. And my question I had for myself was, why is it so hard for politicians to do the right thing? I kind of want to have a go and see if it is that hard, we need change makers at every level of our society and in every location in our society. We need the activists on the streets. We need people within the civil society. We need people in NGOs. We need people in government departments. We need people in Parliament. We need people in business. We need people in the education system. We need every part of society has to have people who are calling for change and protection of the
Yeah.
environment and social justice. So
Yeah.
you definitely need, and in those years of campaigning, there was always political allies. There was always politicians who are on our side, who are fighting for us on the inside, and you need that. And I'm 53 years old now, and I kind of think I've got a lot of experience, and I can bring that to a different realm, I suppose, in Parliament.
Mm. Yeah. Um, do you have a sort of a career high from your time fighting for the environment?
Oh man, that's a big question. Career high. I mean, to be honest, it's the most rewarding thing to do with your life, you know. And so, for people who are considering a pathway of activism, it's tough, man. Like
Mm.
it can be heartbreaking at times, and there's so much you can't help but be personally invested. And it's not a good way to make a living. I mean, there's no money in it. So if you want to be rich, don't be an activist. But boy, you'll do the most meaningful um, things, and you get the most incredible rewards, both in terms of the relationships you form with people, with like-minded people. You form the deepest bonds and friendships because you go through hardship together, and you go through success together. You know, you experience it together. But success looks like something that's much bigger than a personal achievement. It's like, I still think of 137,000 hectares of native forest that is now protected. And
Mm.
those forests are much more ancient than me and will live far beyond my lifetime and the lifetime of my children. And that just makes me feel part of something far bigger than myself. And that feeling of um, being part of an ecosystem and
Mm.
having been part of helping to make sure that those forests stay standing. I can't think of any success or reward or any kind of achievement in life that feels as meaningful or as good as that. You
Mm.
know, and it's always a group effort. Like it took all of us to do it. It's not something that I achieved, but I was one person. I was part of it,
Yeah.
and I still think of that as a big one. I think the offshore oil and gas win was a massive one when we managed to get that moment where Ardern came down and accepted the petition, and we knew at that point that she was going to stop it. I think
Mm.
that's a very particularly satisfying feeling of effective strategy and campaign. Like I was the sort of political strategist for the campaign. I was a campaigner on it as well as a strategist, and
Mm.
that particular approach that we took to kind of get Ardern over the line was very well thought out. We thought long and hard about how do we make them come and want to be part of this and want to associate with making this decision. And that's a whole other conversation. But the point is that it worked. Like when you come
Mm.
up with a strategy and you roll it out and it works, it achieves the outcome and the objective, then it feels very good. It feels like that's the craft of campaigning. That's the craft of being an activist and an advocate. It's not enough just to make the banner. You have to think about what's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and
Mm.
what is our pathway to affecting the change we want to make. You know, and that's where
Yeah.
strategy comes in, and that's
Yeah.
the art of campaigning. So that's one. Those are a couple of examples, but there's so many.
Mm.
There's so many things along the way,
Yeah.
and I feel sort of very gratified to have been part of all these things and honoured to have been part of them.
Mm. Yeah. What do you think about some of the youth-led climate groups that are coming through? I mean, we had school strikes for climate we saw a few years ago, and the new
Yeah.
sort of leaders, Greta Thunberg overseas, Sophie Hanford in New Zealand. Do you have like feedbacks or tips for them that you've picked up over the years?
Yeah, I know Sophie, and I mean, it's a constant renewal of new people coming in, which is great. And we got a huge boost of, is hope the right word? I'm skeptical of the word hope, actually, but we got a huge boost of energy when the school strikes showed up, man. It was just like, wow, we've been banging on about this for years. I mean, literally, my first banner I painted at Greenpeace was a wind turbine down in 1997, calling for action on climate change and opposing gas exploration. In 1997, we're doing this climate change campaigning stuff. And we've been going on about it for years and years and years and years and years, and we'd really struggled to get big mobilizations. It was an issue that we got massive marches against genetic engineering, got massive marches against the mining on conservation estate in 2010, 40,000 strong march. And we couldn't get big mobilizations on climate. It just wasn't an issue that hit people. People wouldn't turn up. The school strikes come along, and suddenly there's these massive mobilizations, like this ability to get loads of people in the street. And we're just all in awe, really. Just like, this is so cool. This is such a shot in the arm for this movement. And like everything, some things work and some things don't work. But that energy that Greta Thunberg inspired school strike brought was hugely important. And I think it had a big effect on the 2017 election, actually. I think it probably helped us get the win on the oil and gas because it was such a hot topic at the time. I think one of the challenges is that you need experience. Any movement and group needs experience to call on, because a lot of the things that happen are not, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You need new ideas, and you need renewal, and you need an imaginative approach to things. So you need the old buggers to get out of the way, and at the same time you need the ability to call on people who've done it before. Like we had Nikki Hager in Native Forest Action, and I think one of the ingredients in the school strikes, which was kind of a bit of a self-destruct button, was that once you left school, you were no longer part of school strike, and you actually needed the ones who'd been part of the original mobilizations to stick around and keep being a guide to the next lot of school strikers. So it kind of had a designed obsolescence in a way, because it was like, hang on a minute, you've lost Hollywood just got this experience, and then they leave school and they're now doing something else. Hopefully they're joining the climate movement in another way. But these are things you see in retrospect, and I think the thing is, what I would say is no movement is perfect. There's no perfect plan. There's no sort of perfect strategy. And who would have known? No one could have, in their strategizing and planning, invented or come up with the idea of Greta Thunberg, of this strike thing. Like, it was completely organic and natural, and it happened, and it was powerful. And I don't know how organic it was, actually. Maybe it was highly thought out by Greta and people around her. But the point is that the impact it had was... So, like, the number one thing I say to activists is, don't do paralysis by analysis. Like, don't overthink it. Just do something. Get out there and do things. And the number one thing you need to do is show up. And you don't have to know everything about campaigning and know everything about strategy. You will learn by doing. It's a haptic process. You have to learn on the job, and you have to learn as you go. And don't ever go, oh, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I should. Just follow your heart and follow your instinct and get out there and have a go. And you'll make mistakes. You'll make many mistakes, and it's okay. You'll learn from them. It's like everything in life. You'll learn from mistakes. And then suddenly the rules and guides and principles of campaigning suddenly make sense, because you've experienced now why you don't do it that way, and why you do it that way, and why that tends to work and that tends not to work. And yet I also feel fundamentally activism and campaigning is a creative endeavor. You have to use your imagination. You have to follow your heart and follow your sort of that's how I've always done it. You have to follow your instinct for what you want, what's going to happen. And you also have to do the thing that feels right and good for you. Like, you should never kind of compromise your core values because of someone telling you you need to do that, not that. And never never compromise the position you take for what is the necessary change to accommodate what you think is politically palatable, what the public are ready to hear. We need to take the radical stand for the necessary change, and we need to communicate it in a way that is comprehensible to a wider audience. But we should never compromise a position of what we need to do to actually save the planet. Otherwise, we're not going to succeed, and there's no point in doing incremental change or superficial change. It's useless to us. We need deep change, and that needs to be
absolutely
where we come from.
How do you feel about the current sort of state of protest laws around the world? I mean, we're seeing what some would describe in certain countries as sort of state backlash to protest and implementation of laws which dissuade people from protest. I guess you saw that a little bit with the Mana Rākau amendment. What are your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible thing. It's an anti-democratic thing. It's against basic freedoms of public expression, which are vital to a free society. Like the right to protest is a very important right in that number of kind of rights that make up a free and democratic society. So it's appalling, and we should resist. That's why the Mana Rākau amendment garnered such ire and reaction, because it's those sorts of laws that prohibit the right to protest are really dangerous for our society. You must have the right of dissent.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final question now, and I think you might have touched on this a little bit before, but what would you say to young people who are wanting to make a change in the world? What advice would you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Get out there and have a go, and work with people who are like-minded. Find the people who you relate to and whose company you enjoy and who you have shared values with, and work on the things that you care about. That's what will keep you in it. And it is about community building, and it is about being part of groups of people, because you can't do it alone. So absolutely, just get out there and have a go, and don't. I think what I've found, particularly in the with the sort of the beginning of the kind of Gen Zero type element of the climate movement, was I felt there's a lot of quite well educated middle class young people in the activist movements who are doing a lot of reading of theory, of strategy and campaign theory and stuff, which is good to do, but not if it paralyzes you, not if it causes you to feel inactive or like you don't know enough. I'm not if it causes you to think, oh, I don't know enough to do this, I need to learn some more. No, you don't. You just need to get out there and do it. It's a learn by doing thing, and there's really experience is the only real teacher, and definitely in the activist space that is true. So my encouragement is like, do it, and you'll never, you make mistakes, and but you'll never regret having been part of affecting change. It's the it's a good way to spend your life.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, Ngā mihi, thanks. That's all the questions that I have for you, but thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, good. It was a pleasure. Good talking.
Yeah, and Ngā mihi everyone at home. Thanks for listening, and hope to catch you on another episode. Kia ora.
See ya.